General Petraeus, thank you very much for joining us today. We really appreciate it.
Pleasure's mine. Thanks, Norm.
Let me do a brief introduction. First, I want to highlight that you're on our National Infrastructure Performance Council, and we really appreciate the support you provide for U.S. infrastructure development. General David Petraeus joined KKR in 2013 and is chairman of the KKR Global Institute, which supports KKR's investment committees, portfolio companies, and investors with analysis of geopolitical and macroeconomic trends, as well as environmental, social, and governance issues. He was made a partner at KKR in 2014. He's also a member of the boards of Optiv for cybersecurity and OneStream for business software. Prior to joining KKR, General Petraeus served over 37 years in the U.S. military, culminating his career with 6 consecutive commands, 5 of which were in combat, including command of coalition forces during the surge in Iraq, command of U.S. Central Command, and command of coalition forces in Afghanistan. Following his service in the military, General Petraeus served as the director of the CIA during a period of significant achievement in the global war on terror. You know, obviously I want to thank you for your service, General Petraeus, but I also want to thank you for your generosity and your intellectual generosity in working with us and sharing ideas and sharing your time with us as well. So thank you very much.
No, I thank you. Again, it's an important mission, a very significant undertaking. As you and I have discussed on many occasions, the world and our country in particular cry out for additional infrastructure investment. One would hope that at a time like this, you know, come next January, we're going to either be making America great again, or we're going to be building back better, whichever it is. There should be a very substantial component of infrastructure investment in it. And in fact, I think the pandemic has highlighted the lack of certain infrastructure in the United States and around the world. And that is that not all Americans have reliable access to high-speed broadband. And that makes you a distinct have-not in a situation where it's not just that many of us are operating from home, it's that many of our kids are being schooled from home over, again, internet connections. And if you don't have reliable high-speed broadband, then you've got real challenges.
It's really true, and I couldn't agree more. Let me jump into a couple of questions that we have for you, and then I know the audience will have some questions as well. And we have about 22 minutes, so we want to be we want to be rich in terms of how we use your time. According to IMF projections, the global economy is set to decline by almost 5% this year. Some countries like Mexico, India, South Africa, they'll decline by more than 10% this year. How can we help those economies recover, and how do global investors address these issues? It seems to me that there's a tremendous opportunity to make strategic investments, that are not only good for business, but also material to the driving a global and robust global recovery. So that's just to get your perspective. Sure. Would be great. Thank you so much.
Well, the answer to that is that the we that you said, how can we help, has to be writ very large. You have to define that as a very all-encompassing term. Certainly, firms like KKR, where, as you noted, I'm privileged to be a partner, we're very big in the infrastructure space around the world, in fact. But of course, what we're going to do is look for opportunities to build or take over infrastructure that will provide a reasonable return for those whose money we are managing. That goes without saying. So that may or may not be the infrastructure project that a country needs most. And we should note that there should be very real concern about those emerging market economies that are going to be hurt most by the economic collapse in the wake of the pandemic, and also by the pandemic itself. These are countries that do not have the monetary and fiscal firepower that the US has demonstrated, that the EU, for the first time ever, almost a common fiscal support package, if you will, the UK, Japan, China, other major economies of the world are able to employ those kinds of assets. And there are a lot of countries that just cannot do that. And they are going to have trouble. So they're not going to have the support for their citizens that, again, you're seeing or have seen in the United States. We hope that there will be another package certainly before the election in our country, and that we've seen in a number of other countries. So now the we has to be expanded, obviously, to include the IMF. I've actually talked to the managing director of the IMF in recent weeks in a Zoom session. She's very engaged in addressing these kinds of issues, but they'll need more lending power over time. That, again, means that the we includes the major countries of the world that can help the IMF expand its assets under management, if you will. Certainly the World Bank will play a very important role in this. The regional development banks have assets, the IDB and a variety of others like that. And then, of course, you have the development agencies. And of course, the US just recapitalized the International Development Finance Corporation, or the DFC for short, as it is now called, to the tune of $60 billion. If you put that together with the UK's development bank, the DFID, Japan, which is still, by the way, the largest outside investor in Southeast Asia, and a variety of other allies and partners around the world with whom we share values and systems and approaches, you have very, very significant investment firepower. So it's going to be, as always, it's always going to be a multilateral equation, a comprehensive approach. It is going to be government and private sector. And the key is for these countries to ensure that potential investors, again, of whatever type, private or government or international, that the projects are ready, they're scoped out, they're the most important, and at the end of the day, will do what infrastructure, when best provided, does, which is to improve productivity of the workers of that particular economy. And of course, when we did this, I think it was last year, we highlighted the importance, again, of those projects that will specifically improve aspects of infrastructure that will then translate into improved productivity in the United States. And the same should be true of every country.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And one of the things that I think we're all well aware is for the U.S. to be useful and productive overseas in terms of infrastructure, we need to be useful and productive at home in terms of infrastructure.
Absolutely.
I want to keep you out of trouble, but I want to give you a question around the idea that the world is actually changing quickly, politically, and also in terms of technology and in terms of global governance. You mentioned a number of global governing institutions. What's the right role for the U.S.? I wonder if the focus should be on stability, sort of Henry Kissinger, or should we be driving change? Just to try to get a sense of that, because there's so much in flux globally, and COVID simply highlights what we're already experiencing.
I don't think it's an either or. I think it's an this and that. My view, and you've heard me express this before, is that the U.S. as the leading economy of the world, the only truly global military capability in the world, the leader in technology in a variety of different areas, in so many different respects, that when you have a global problem like a global pandemic, a global economic collapse, frankly, global climate change, you name it, whatever the issue is, if it is global, you have to have a global response. But to be truly global in responding, at the end of the day, the most important economy in the world is going to have to be either the leader or among the leaders. Now, obviously, there is increasing friction between China and the United States, and frankly, a number of other countries around the world, some of it a bit puzzling. I have long been an advocate of a relationship between the two greatest countries of the world that is as mutually beneficial as is possible, noting that clearly there are very significant aspects of competition and that those have got to be managed. And some of those have emerged in greater relief during the pandemic and in the wake of the economic collapse that accompanied that. That said, again, those two countries and the other major countries and blocs, talking about the EU, of course, but also Germany within it, have got to be at the forefront of any global approach to the problems that we are experiencing. And you would like to hope that there could be cooperative endeavors forged, at least in some of the respects that we're talking about, while noting that it's fine to have competition in others. The Belt and Road Initiative is a provision of what many countries see as much needed assistance in building their infrastructure, as China essentially connects its country with all the way into Western Europe and down into South Asia, and then maritime into the Gulf and to East Africa and a variety of other locations, as well as east to North and South America. That's all understandable. In some cases, we certainly should compete with them for the privilege of doing some of these projects for some of our partners, certainly our allies and others around the world. And again, if you put together what I described as the DFC and all these other development institutions, you would have a very, very good and healthy level of competition. So again, at the end of the day, I think it's sort of inescapable that to address global challenges, you have to have a global response that is led, at least in part, by the United States, and then together with the other major countries of the world. You could start out with the G7, take it from there, then open it up and bring others in. But again, there's going to have to be a multilateral, multinational response to what clearly is an international problem.
Great, really appreciate that, and I couldn't agree more. We are suffering through what, by the way, there are a lot of questions for you, so
Great.
We appreciate it. We are suffering through what, to my mind, is a black swan event. Historically, this kind of unforeseen, deeply disruptive event tends to generate a series of aftershocks that go on for years. What are the big risks that you see in the global economy going forward, let's say the next 3, 4, 5 years, and perhaps especially in emerging markets, because this sort of unforeseen consequences of an unforeseen event, they happen?
Well, I think that you should look first at countries that had what might be described as pre-existing conditions. Just like individuals in facing the coronavirus, if you have certain pre-existing conditions, you are more vulnerable to it should you contract the virus. And in this case, economically, there are countries that did indeed and do have these pre-existing conditions. They typically involve a very high debt to GDP ratio, debt that might be denominated in other currencies. Now, there is some good news here that the concerns about countries that had very large dollar denominated debt, should interest rates go up, would have been in a very, very difficult situation. Think of Turkey or perhaps Argentina, some others, again, that are trying to figure out how to repay debts that are coming due. And this is obviously where the extraordinary monetary expansion of the U.S., which has driven interest rates down essentially in real terms to zero, and now pledged, and again, most recently yesterday, I think it was, again, to keep them down at that level for several years at the very least. And, you know, apparently we don't have to worry about the Phillips curve anymore. It really it just doesn't seem to exist the way that it used to. I'm not just talking about ignoring it. It's just that that curve is no longer as sensitive at various levels as it used to be, right. Certainly when we went through graduate school. So that's where I would be worried first. But then second, if you look once again at the countries that lack the monetary and fiscal firepower that we have employed and other major economies of the world have employed, and you think about what that could do to those who are at the marginal level of existence, and what that could mean in terms of refugee crises.
Right.
I mean, we've seen what has happened in the past as a result of wars in a variety of places, most significantly the Syrian civil war and the tsunami of refugees that resulted from that, and the enormous domestic political pressures that put on our European allies, our NATO allies. Actually, this is the most significant domestic issue they've had to deal with since the end of the Cold War. We've seen this similarly, not just with economic inadequacies in a variety of places, but you also see, because of the increased desertification, where land is no longer arable, say on the edges of the Sahel. And again, you see a migration of hundreds of thousands, in some cases of millions of people. And does this kind of economic collapse, if unaddressed around the world, and of course, it's also the fact that these countries lack the health resources on top of everything else. And in fact, they really can't lock down, because if they lock down, the 40% of their workforce that literally is working from day to day to put food on the table each night goes hungry. Again, you can see the level of vulnerabilities that I'm laying out, any one of which could lead to very significant mass movement of people, and together, and then throw in some wars and a few other issues, some environmental challenges that can occur, and you can see the very real prospect of very significant issues for countries that are within reach of these areas. And that could well affect our own country as well, when you look at the challenges within Latin America that have been posed by the pandemic and the associated economic downturn.
Yeah, it's really an amazing picture. One of the questions, I'm going to paraphrase it a little bit, but one of the questions has to do with this growing amount of instability, and what's the role of infrastructure and infrastructure investment? Because, you know, the way we started the conversation was focused on private investment, focused on a return, but there's also this notion of infrastructure investment that maybe comes from, as you mentioned, the World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, et cetera. And what we see people needing are things like water and better mobility, things that lead to productivity, but also things that provide them with better health. How would you answer that question in terms of the role of infrastructure, especially over the next 2 or 3 years, to put a floor under the economic issues and to help people start to rise again?
Well, it's crucial.
Yeah.
Please recall that, you know, I had the privilege of essentially helping to rebuild Iraq from the depths of the damage sustained up into, and then in the early months of the surge, where, I mean, we had a whole bridge slide. All the bridges had been blown up north and northwest of Baghdad. The oil pipelines were all broken. There were no basic services for many of the people in various districts and provinces. Electrical towers were on their side. So again, we're talking about just reestablishing basic services for starters. But then what happens is you have this virtuous cycle where let's say you repair a road that improves access to the market. You can get the market pump primed again. Now people are coming in, and one good deed, if you will, leads to another. Even again, without the presence of, say, the challenge of extremists or insurgents, you still have situations where if you can improve a variety of different elements of infrastructure, it makes new economic opportunity possible. Obviously, the extension of electricity has done so much for a variety of countries around the world. When you think of what happens in African countries when that touches an area that hasn't had reliable electricity before, then add on top of that internet service or again, just cell tower service, and you have electronic banking. I mean, it opens up all kinds of opportunities to people who just have not had those prior to the establishment of that element of infrastructure. It's a little difficult to identify which will be the best one. Although again, if you're at the rock bottom and you don't have, again, the very basics that we've discussed of, again, access to water, shelter, again, electricity, food, needless to say. And if you don't have that, you won't be able to stay in that location, even if it's where you were born and raised and generations prior were born and raised, however much you may want to stay and continue the pursuits that have been traditional. So again, it's just the power of infrastructure is extraordinary. I remember in the very beginning in Iraq when I was a two-star general and we're up in Mosul in northern Iraq, and there was an irrigation system that had been heavily damaged really during the Saddam regime. It had fallen into some degree of disrepair, and then some of the post-war looting as well. And we patched up this entire irrigation system with lots of additional elements of infrastructure in it, not just the initial flow from the lake. And I remember turning the valve for that, and literally with that turn of a valve, we were now irrigating 280,000 acres of Western Nineveh province that otherwise were not arable. They couldn't be farmed. And this just, it gave life back to that particular region. And there's a variety of examples of that beyond water getting into electricity, getting into a variety of other opportunities that are enabled by what seems to be the very simple provision of some basic element of any economy.
That's really important. We have a session, General Petraeus, this afternoon on something we call a benefits index. The idea to create a benefits index so that governments can decide which are the highest priority projects, and the international community can figure out how to support those projects. And that I think is really important.
Sure, and of course, I mean, as a former economics professor, the answer to that, to a question like that, is always going to be, it depends, because there is no school solution that fits every particular situation. You've got to do a basic assessment. It's pretty straightforward. There's a template for it. We did this. This is, again, what our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines did. This is why Tom Brokaw said this is surely the new greatest generation when he saw all that they were engaged in. And it all came back to infrastructure. Again, when you repair the bridge over the Tigris River that reconnects two communities that had been cut off, and they can once again start to trade the way they used to. This side has this particular commodity, this one has that, and now all of a sudden they can share. It's quite dramatic to see what happens. That kind of ribbon cutting or valve turning or what have you, switch flipping, it feels pretty wonderful.
That's really great. And I want to thank you. And I'd forgotten to mention that you're a PhD from Princeton. So thank you very much for your answers. Very helpful, very enlightening. And we look forward to continuing to work with you. And thank you so much for your service as well.
No, I thank you, Norm. Thanks. This is a tremendous initiative, as you and I and Hank Greenberg have always agreed since the outset. I applaud what it is you're doing, and I'm delighted that we could carve out this 30-minute period to spend with you. Congratulations.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Have a good afternoon.
Pleasure. You bet.